It's one of the most deadly realities in the trades, the pressures that workers face at home, on the job, and in the spaces in between.
So there's no real boundaries for people to ever kind of get a break from the things, that they're dealing with.
Jenny Lavin, founder of Union Care Solutions, breaks down why this crisis demands industry-level attention and what it really takes to build safe, connected, and resilient crews.
Psychological safety is kind of what happens on the crews and at the workplace. A lot of things are caught, not taught.
This is the WorkReady podcast. Work in the field is tough, and it takes more than muscle to last. Around here, we're building a place where workforce athletes can pick up proven ways to stay strong, earn respect, and lead their crews without burning out. If you want to be a part of that, subscribing is the easiest way to stay connected and keep growing with us. Hello and welcome to the WorkReady podcast. I'm your host, Dr. Kevin Rindal. My guest is Jenny Lavin, founder of Union Care Solutions, which is leading the charge to address two of the biggest threats to the workforce athlete, suicide and overdose. If you care about the people under the hard hat, this is an episode that you'll definitely want to listen to the very end. Jenny, welcome to the WorkReady podcast. Can you share a bit about your background and what inspired you to launch Union Care Solutions?
Well, I started Union Care Solutions a couple years ago. My husband got a new role at the union. He's the business manager of Local 47. Previous to that, his father, Pat Lavin, was business manager. I have my brother-in-laws are in the trade, they're linemen. And so my kids themselves are fourth generation IBW members, but I kind of grew up as a wife, and a mother in this trade, seeing the families, going to picnics, traveling, seeing what the IBW has to offer. And, it's always been about family and connection for me. And so when my husband took over and had this new role of leadership and my kids were growing up, they were starting to enter the trade. So, priorities kind of shifted and I started to see a lot of things that he was dealing with the membership and the families. And it was heartbreaking. He was going to funerals for people, and when you start to find out what was going on and that they were either drug related or people were dying by suicide, and it kind of hit me, and we were having a hard time dealing with it, just as a husband and wife. As a wife trying to support her husband in the job that he does, this stuff takes a toll. And so we started to look and see what else is there, like we're missing something, because if we're having a hard time with this, we know other people are having a hard time with this. And so that was how I kind of found my way along the way. It wasn't something I had started out really clear about what we were gonna find. And so we started to look at maybe chaplaincy and seeing if there was like a gap in support for people within the trade. And that was how we found something called critical incident stress management. And so it's something that it can kind of support people after. There's really no care for these guys after critical incidences. And so it's kind of blossomed from there, and we've added peer support and some other things.
I've seen you present at a few different conferences, and most recently at the International Line Rodeo Safety Conference, and you really dug in deep into some of the issues that and the pressures that people are facing on the job currently. And then you provided some really great solutions that people could walk away with. And so first question that I have for you is, what are the pressures that you hear from frontline workers and people in the trades, both at work and home, that are really driving some of these, these issues that you just talked about, like overdoses and suicides? What are those pressures?
Well, so I teach a lot of the classes at the local JETC. So I have the honor of, teaching apprentices at different levels of their apprenticeship. And so, a lot of things that I hear from them, that it's very normal for the trade, right? You have travel, they're away from their families, they're sleeping in hotels, and so you have the job aspect of it, but also you have the family aspect and implications of that as well, right? And so, it's hard to be a provider and be present at the same time. And so you've got people that are missing, soccer games, or I've heard christenings for their children, like these big events that they're not able to be a part of, right? And so it not only causes the stress for them that, and they miss it, they love their families, they want to be a part of it, but they have to work. But it's also the dynamic that's left at home, that dealing with, their spouse is being upset that they're not able to make this, or maybe they don't understand, right? Or, leaving the kids at home. Now there's so much access too. So if somebody leaves work and they're having an argument with a spouse at home, chances are, they might get a text later, referencing that argument, or, you know what I mean? And so then they're not able to be fully present at the job. They're bringing in these like real life family struggles onto the job. And then, which creates stress on the job. And then sometimes they're bringing that stress of the job back at home. So there's no real boundaries for people to ever kind of get a break from the things, that they're dealing with.
And when you talk to crews and you have these conversations, because of that scenario that you painted of people being on the road, missing key events, the stress that happens, like what do people do to cope with that? And how do they turn that off, or what
Yeah,
does it
I
turn into?
think Yeah, I think they cope with it the best that they can, I mean, now, like I said before, we do have phones, so there is a silver lining to that. You can FaceTime, you can call, you can stay connected, you can call home and read a book to your kids, for bedtime, you get to check in that way. Um, but it really does seem the people that are successful that I have seen that are in this trade that are still doing the same stuff, right? They're still waking up at 3 in the morning, they're traveling, they're out of town, they have good relationships with their spouses, and they invest in the time, and it can be very hard, right? To step away. Like sometimes, you get ready for work, and what you need to do, you get ready, you get your lunch, you pack up, but how do you get ready for coming home? How do you like get yourself mentally ready? Like, what? I'm gonna go and I'm tired, but I'm gonna go sit and I'm going to have dinner with my family, or I'm going to have that conversation before bedtime, with my child. And so the people that I have seen that do it really well, and you can kind of tell when you meet, because like I said, we get to meet a lot of families and stuff, and you can tell like the wives are on it, they're taking care of the stuff at Move. They have mastered the art of cover and move, you know what I mean? And so I would say it's just we really only get these small moments, and the little things are the big things. And so it's really just the, staying connected with the family and being present and kind of rechecking and saying, okay, I know I'm tired, but okay, what do you need? And being engaged and present in the moments that you do have, I think can make a big difference.
Yeah, and I've seen such incredible examples of that. Over the last 10 years, I've really focused my career on working in the trades and have been able to go to family picnics, or the IBW
Mm-hmm.
picnics, and
Yeah.
different family events and international line rodeo and even local rodeos. And you just see that community aspect and how much people care for each other and their families. And that's such an awesome culture. Uh, I do want to shift gears though, because in this presentation you talked about those pressures, though those pressures can mount. And
Mm-hmm.
what we're seeing is, and this is where we get into, I think the reality of the statistics is that, OSHA has what they call the fatal four: slips, trips, and falls, caught in between, electrocution, and struck by. Those are the four most common ways that people die from on-the-job injuries. But you talked about the fatal fifth, which is mental health, and it relates
Mm-hmm.
to the overdose and the suicide rates that we're seeing. And you presented some pretty startling statistics in that presentation. Can you share more on that?
Yeah. So for the fatal fifth, mental health, I think when we think about mental health, there's another component that I have kind of found along the way, which is psychological safety. And so when we think about mental health, that's kind of the way I kind of understand it. It's like that's what we bring, that's my own mental health. That's how I process things, the way that I'm responding to things, what I'm bringing into the job as a person, right? That's my own health. psychological safety is kind of what happens on the cruise and at the workplace, right? And so if it's just like we think of a physically safe work environment, I'm sure there's a million things we could think about, run it through OSHA, all the things, right? But like when we talk about psychological safety, it really is how the crew dynamic is, right? And is this a place where people are, where it's a safe place to learn or to grow or, just to be, and there isn't, and depending on what and they go hand in hand, right? Because what we bring, if we're not well, if we're struggling, if we're stressed, if we're struggling with depression or anxiety, or we're angry and we're bringing that in onto the job, that's going to affect the work environment, and it's going to affect the people that are around us.
Vimosity is more than training. It's a safety and readiness platform trusted by companies to keep their field professionals strong, healthy, and ready for the job. Now we're launching something new, the WorkReady community. It's the first online community built exclusively for field employees, a place to connect, learn, and lead the future of our industry. Join us and be part of the movement.
I think that is such a key component to the solution, is creating that psychologically safe environment. And so we'll definitely want to double click on that and talk about some of the barriers to getting help. But going back to some of those stats that you listed, so when it comes to workplace injuries, 13 out of every 100,000 on the job experience a fatal work injury, but the rates of suicide are 45 individuals per 100,000, and the rate of overdose deaths is 130 deaths per 100,000. So again, just to put things in context, 4 times the number of on-the-job deaths is the suicide rate, and 10 times is the rate of overdose deaths. And so I'd like to understand that a little bit more. I know that you've really looked into this, and fortunately what we're seeing is a real positive trend over the last year or two in terms of some of those numbers coming down. It really peaked definitely right after COVID. But as you've done the research, what are some things that you would attribute to those, again, alarming rates?
Yeah, well, so like the statistics, like those are like some of the national averages. And so at Local 47, we've been tracking. And so for the local, we've had 5 fatal work injuries, 19 suicides, and 22 drug overdoses. And you're right, they have leveled gratefully, right? And so, but it was something that really peaked after COVID, right? Like that 2003, like and 2002, we saw such an uptick of that stuff. And so that was really when I started doing Union Care Solutions and kind of trying to find out, like, what are we missing, right? But it's hard because when we talk about the drug overdoses and the suicides, and and those are just the numbers that we get. Sometimes people don't report it, and so there are like insurance reasons why people don't report suicides. And so it's something that, when you think of the suicides, so a lot of those have had drugs and alcohol be part of the process, right? And so, drug and alcohol misuse is something that is very prevalent in the trade. It's prevalent, across the board. And it's something, when we talk about alcohol, and referencing, apprentices and things like that, when they're going out of town, they're away from their families. All there really is, they show up for work, they go back to the hotel, and then they go to the bar. Like, it is a very normal standard thing. There's not much else to do, right? So drinking becomes a very acceptable form of, camaraderie and getting together. And so it, which, can be okay. But when somebody's already struggling and they're using the substance to get by, or to, kind of numb themselves or to check out, that's where, it becomes an issue, and so I've been in recovery, I'm sober today, gratefully, and it's something that has been a struggle. And so, and it's a struggle when, you're dealing with things and you still have to show up for work, right? Like you have to kind of muscle through it, and you have to pull yourself together. And so, it becomes kind of this cycle. You're drinking all night, you go wake up, you're probably hungover, that might level out about noon, after a gas station hot dog and a Monster, and so then you're, getting ready, and then you do it again, and I think that's what's hard, because it is acceptable. And so if somebody is struggling with something, they might not be able to talk about that, because who are they going to talk to? Everybody on the crew they're all doing the same thing, and so they kind of keep it bottled up, and it seems to just, add up, so.
One of the encouraging things that I've noticed is that just the whole topic of mental health has become
Yeah,
much more at the forefront with the utilities and construction companies that we work with. And it's something that they're actively trying to address it and come up with solutions and talk about it. And
absolutely.
that's been something that I'd say has really accelerated over the last several years. Uh, but what are some of the barriers that keep people from getting help? And even if, resources are present, what are some of those things that oftentimes, and you talked about psychological safety. I think psychological
Yeah.
safety, if that's not there, people are not going to get help. But what are some of the other barriers that maybe prevent people from, speaking up or raising their hand?
Well, I think, construction, and specifically our industry, is a male dominated field. And so you kind of have this man up culture, right? Very stoic, which, it's kind of like suck it up, buttercup, you throw some dirt on it, you keep going, and it works for a lot of people for a while, and it works until it doesn't, and so I think there is just the culture of that men are told, that if they're struggling, then they're not cut out for this work, so they don't even consider if they're struggling or not, or that that they're weak if they need help, which is a lie, right? Everybody needs help sometimes. And so, I think there's the culture part of it. And then also there's job consequences, if you're not fit for duty, or if you say you have a problem, and then you maybe have a foreman that doesn't like you, and so then here's a random drug test, or you know what I mean, they'll use that information against you, and right now, like even in construction, I was kind of shocked to see, like, there is no PTO. So like at the utilities, you get vacation, or right, paid time off. That doesn't happen in construction. There's no PTO, there's no sick time. So it's hard enough to get yourself to go to a doctor appointment, let alone now you have to take time off and you're not getting paid. So I think that's a huge barrier, right? And then also sometimes just not understanding or knowing. When I started this and I started taking the classes, and all the classes I've been taking are things anybody can take, their certifications, anybody on a crew can take. That was really important to us at the nonprofit, is that we build resources that, you don't have to have a master's or a bachelor's to get educated and find resources, right? And so when I was taking these classes, I was like, oh my goodness, I think I've struggled with depression and anxiety my whole life. And here I thought, I'm just white knuckling motherhood. I have, my kids I had 3 under 3, and so I just had no idea that some of these things I was going to be able to address them, right? And so had I had some of these tools earlier, I think that there were things that I probably would have had an easier time with, and maybe not been so hard on myself, right? I think when we struggle with mental health, we're so hard on ourselves
Hmm.
because we think it's something that we can just figure out or suck it up, right? And walk off, right? But it's like if somebody breaks their leg, you do not expect them to go run a marathon like the next week, And so I think we think that when we struggle with things, we don't give ourselves the space to deal with it, because there's a lot of guilt and shame, and sometimes we just don't understand it. And so I think that, also just the basic fear of judgment, right? Like sometimes when we share stories, and we don't realize that there's a lot of people that deal with this stuff. And, teaching the classes, and I've probably taught maybe 150 to 200 apprentices. And it's like, it's the same stuff. Every class, it's all the same stuff. Like there's like every once in a while, I'll hear something new that's like, wow, that's out of pocket. Like that's a new one, but but I would say 95% of the things that everybody struggles with, it's all the same, right? It's the stress, it's the being away from home, it's the probably drinking too much, it's when drinking becomes and it affects your family or your relationships or your job performance, just spousal issues, not eating well, like I said, on the road, sometimes the gas station is the only option, and we know like nutrition is such an important part of mental health, and it can really change the way we address issues in our own life. So I would say those are kind of the big ones that I have seen.
Yeah, it's interesting too that you say that there's no PTO as well and the pressure to continue to work, because I think about
Mm-hmm.
the prevalence of like musculoskeletal injuries and even pain on the job. I mean, we survey people with Vimosity, and we find sometimes that like as high as 80% of the people that are surveyed say that they experience pain like on a regular basis.
Yeah.
And so that, if you're providing for your family and you have to show up to work, you have to continue to work through it. It's easy to go down the path of maybe taking opioids or alcohol, things to deal with pain that way as a coping mechanism. And it doesn't take that long before those start to really take hold from an addictive standpoint. And I remember you sharing some of the stats just related
Mm-hmm.
to the potency of opioids and how those can create a dependence. Do you still see that as being a major factor? I
I
know
do.
we've
Yeah.
taken some big strides to try to get people away from that, but it's still present, I think.
Yeah, because it's a quick fix, right? And so if somebody doesn't have time to go to the doctor or their shoulder's bugging them, you know what I mean? They're probably going to pop a pill, right? And it only takes something like 8 days for your body to become addicted to the substance. And so, and also the thing about opioids, right? It's like the damage is still there, right? So you're not addressing like the root cause of the injury, right? So you're just kind of masking the pain. And so you're still out there working, probably creating more damage to the joint or the shoulder or the knees, you know what I mean? And so it's something that it's a quick fix and it's a temporary fix, but it can cause other issues, and we've had, I've heard stories of guys, working in Vegas and it's hot during the day. And so they work at night. And so in order to, stay up, they're taking methamphetamines, because they have to work at night. And it just becomes something that is just part of the job. It's very prevalent. It's very common, and it's accepted because these guys are showing up to do a job and they need to provide for their families, and so that's where when we talk about the job consequences and how do we, like you had mentioned, there's a lot of talk, when we talk about some of the higher level organizations with IBW and with NICA and with the utilities, you have, the people in the office and that kind of run things at these higher levels. They're interested in this conversation because they are impacted as well, right? And so but it's kind of like, how do we create a recovery friendly work environment, right? And how do we talk about this stuff and get people help without saying, oh, you pop dirty, we're going to fire you, because a lot of times they just go back to work, they're in the same industry, they're finding their way somewhere else, and so it's not good for the industry on a work perspective. But the reality is if we care about people and we say we care about people and mental health, it can't just be a box to check. We have to be willing to learn and to say, you know what, I don't struggle with that, but I know that you do. And I know a lot of people do. And we're going to find answers to try to get you the help that you need. And we're going to protect your job until you come back and you're ready, to deal with this stuff. And so there are people that I think that would get help if they could. And, some of the stuff is above my pay grade, with the way that guys have their paid time off and things like that. But those are things that we can look at, and these are practical ways, right? And these are things, giving people the paid time off to be able to go to the doctor, or go seek recovery without worrying that, that they're not going to have a job when they come back.
One of the things that I think your organization is doing really well is creating a space for people to have that conversation and to speak openly. And I want to, when I say tough guy mentality, I want to say men and women, because I know a lot of women who are in the trades as well, but just I do want to, I think
sometimes they're tougher.
yeah, 100%.
Yeah.
But there is that tough guy mentality where you don't want to
Yeah.
talk about it, the rub the dirt on it. I mean, it kind of almost goes back to old school sports. I think about, nobody talked about being injured. You just play through it. But I think your organization, what you've been able to do is create a forum for people to have those open conversations. And one thing that stands out to me is when we were at the local 47 safety conference, you had the panel that you led, and there are several people on that panel who literally said that they're like, I never in a million years would admit my weakness to other people on my crew. And it wasn't until I started to see my comrades fall that I realized there's a problem that we have to address. We need to start talking about that. And they, you know, it was very uncomfortable for them to set themselves into an environment where they did, talk about their vulnerabilities, talk about, the things that they struggled with. And the interesting thing is it gave a lot of power to other people on their crews to also step up and speak because they saw that example. Can you share? And again, this all goes back to like psychological safety, creating an environment where people feel comfortable, but maybe how you've seen some of the groups that you've helped facilitate get people to speak up who maybe normally wouldn't want to even like address any of these topics, and how that's emboldened other people.
Yeah, so the panel that you're referring to, that was the local 47, their CISM team. And so CISM, it stands for Critical Incident Stress Management. And so currently there isn't any aftercare for crews that experience either these near misses or fatalities, or accidents on the job, right? And so that was something that was really important and is really kind of the cornerstone of Union Care Solutions, is getting these individuals trained, people that are on the crews, right? It's not an outside organization that's coming in that's helping them process things. These are the guys, these are their brothers on the crew. They've worked with them, they've known them in the industry. And so when there is a fatality or a near miss, or deploying these guys that are trained in critical incident stress management, they go and they do something called a debriefing. And so the debriefing is something where you take the people, and it needs to be a homogenous group. So it's not always good to have maybe the safety guy. You're probably isn't going to want to sit in this group. You're going to want to get the crew that was directly impacted by this critical incident, right? And so they go into a room that's separate, and the debriefing is led by, in our case, another lineman that is skilled in this, has been trained in critical incident stress management. And they go over, it's like a 9-step process, and they talk about what they saw, how they felt, like anything that pops up, and it's a whole thing. And what I have seen is, people that have been hesitant to go in, kind of reluctantly go and sit down, and then they spend the next 2.5 hours debriefing in a group with everybody that was there, and they're able to process the things that they saw. They're able to kind of put together, what happened, and it really is a place where they're able to talk about openly what went on, and a lot of times when we talk about accidents and things, you have legal that shows up, right? You have the safety guy, there's a lot of box checking exercises that need to happen, that have nothing to do with the care of the people that were involved, that just witnessed this horrific accident, right? And so it's within that trusted brotherhood that they get to debrief and they get to talk, and I've been able to connect with people, like some of the, the like switchboard, like grid operators that are kind of not part of the crew, but they're part of what has happened. Like some of those people don't even get touched. Nobody checks on them. And meanwhile, they're going through all of this stuff on their own, and they're dealing with probably the stress or the guilt of possibly being a part of what happened. And so we've seen a really great, when people start talking about things, other people are like, oh yeah, that happened to me too. And then they start talking. And even just in our trainings, I've had gentlemen come up to me and share stories that happened 20 years ago about, being part of a car hit pole and having to, and a lot of times these guys are zero responders. They're there before first responders, and their job is to make sure that the scene is safe for those other guys to come in and, take care of their job. Right. And so, these are just things that aren't talked about. But once you start talking about it, and then they're like, well, I want to talk about it. And they share your story, and so it's and a lot of the guys that go through it, that's why it's really important. We have the CISM teams are have found their home with some of the troublemen at the utility, because again, they're out there and they're usually a crew of one. So they're rolling up at some accident, at 2 a.m, and it's a fatality, and they're dealing with that on their own, and so giving them the space to talk with each other, because a lot of times they're not going to want to go home and talk with their families because they don't want to bring that stuff home, right? These guys they kind of keep it to themselves. So, the hope is that the more that they talk about it, the more it becomes normalized, and it's just like, yeah, man, this was rough, or and it doesn't get I think when people think of talking about this stuff, they think it kind of goes down and you're sitting around, it's like this kumbaya circle, we're all talking about our feelings, right? And yes, your feelings are talked about, but it becomes more just about replay of what happened, right? And so I think that the guys that are part of it, at Local 47, they've done a really good job, and they do a really good job of honoring each other and checking in on each other. And that's really what it comes down to, is checking in on your brother and sisters in the job. And if somebody goes through something that that is a hard thing, check in on them and be like, hey, how did that go? Like, that had to have been awful. Or it was a really shitty day, and sometimes just when we say this stuff and we're able to just express it, it takes the power out of it, and it goes from circling around in our head that makes us crazy and stressed and angry, and then we can release it and let it go, and then it's like you have such a weight lifted off your shoulders, and so I've seen it, and I've seen it work, and it's really impactful. And so it's really cool to see the guys step up and share their stories, and they can do a way better job of supporting each other than I can, right? So a lot of those things I don't go into, I kind of stay in the background, because I really do want to help build something that's kind of like this for us, by us mentality. And in that case, it's for them, by them. We have to trust. And that can be kind of the rub. It can be hard for management or some of these, classifications that are sort of outside the crew, to let that go and be like, hey, I know you need help. I'm not the right person for that, but I do know someone that is. And that can be the hardest thing to do, is to support somebody from a little far away, right? It's kind of a check on our ego, and but I think when you can be a part of it and you see it work, and you see these guys show up and stuff happens and they're checking in on each other on their own, and you don't even have to facilitate it, it's pretty cool to see.
So awesome, Jenny, because I bet you a lot of people listening to this interview are like, yeah, 15 years ago, I experienced XYZ incident. I've never talked about it since, and I've just been internalizing that. And I'm sure that's a really common story for people in this industry. And man, it, like you said, it totally takes the power out of that when you have the chance to get it out there. And it probably builds really strong bonds too, because there's so many people with that shared experience who it opens them up for to have those conversations. And so I think the cool part about what you're doing is that you're just facilitating a conversation for people and letting them run with it. And sometimes people just need some type of structure so that they can have those conversations. And so that's one of the things that I think is great about your model. If someone is listening and they want training for CISM facilitation, what is the process on getting certified or just getting the training so that people can do that for their crews or their teams?
Yeah, so we partnered with, or the trainings that I do are through an organization called ICISF, and it's International Critical Incident Stress Foundation, and they're wonderful. And it really is a lot of the people that are trained are chaplains that are through police and fire. And so when I first started, I went to a police officer's chaplain conference, and I was, trying to figure out what this stuff was. And that was when I learned about it. And I was like, oh my goodness, this is so rad. We need to get the guys, these guys need this stuff. And so they offer trainings throughout the year. There's virtual trainings. There's been stuff at Local 47 that we've put together. I'm hoping to be able to put together something as almost like a conference kind of thing where we can invite other people from the industry. That's kind of my dreams for, the nonprofit. But ICISF.org, they can go on there and they can learn more about it. They have, it's group crisis intervention and individual crisis intervention. And so right now, Local 47 has something, I think over 100 people that are trained in this stuff. And so they have just started rolling out like mental health first aid as well. And so they have so many trainings. They talk about, emotional and spiritual support after a crisis, peer-to-peer models. And so that's kind of the next one that's on my list to take. And so they make it really easy to get this training, and they're very reasonable, and it's an organization that really cares about this stuff and getting people the help that they need. And so, so they can go on there and do that. And, some of the other trainings that, like I mentioned, is this mental health first aid. That's something that anybody can take. And so we've also had a lot of success with Vital Cog, which is another training. It's a suicide prevention training, and they are rolling out some extra trainings as well, like recovery-friendly work environment and also peer support that I'm really excited about. So, it really kind of goes in that, like, that's that train, mobilize, deploy model, right? Like, that's kind of narrowed it down. It's, there's really nothing new under the sun. This is kind of it, right? Like, we want to get people trained. We want them to be put into peer support groups. We want them to be able to be connected. And then we want people to be able to send people out that are trained in this stuff to do a debriefing. So
if I'm a frontline leader, obviously I can go down and get the mental health first aid training, the CISM training, just to be empowered with the tools to be able to handle stuff when crisis presents. But what are some things that people can even do just to look for warning signs on their crews that maybe something isn't okay with one of their teammates, and what can they do just very practically to support them, to ask what's going on, how can I support you? Because you talk a lot about like being our brother or sister's keeper. Like, one of the greatest defenses against some of those stats that we talked about earlier is identifying it, addressing it, and then empowering people with, some type of solution that they can play an active role in so that they can get people the help that they need. But what are some signs that people could look for in others, especially on their crews, so that they could support them?
Well, and so I think first off, really knowing your crew, especially if you're a foreman or in any role of leadership, which I believe when you're on a crew, I mean, we're all leaders, right? But knowing your crew and kind of knowing when somebody is having an off day, or if they do seem agitated. I think anger and aggression, can be something that is an indication of like what's going on, right? And sometimes the day is frustrating, or you're doing something hard, or it's hot, or you didn't eat breakfast or whatever, right? But just checking in with people, like, hey dude, like, are you okay? Like, are you good? But also there's, when we talk about, suicide, sometimes people, they will say things, and they will give something called an invitation, and they might say something out of pocket, like, well, I just, I don't even know why I'm here, or, things that are even harder to hear. And sometimes it could just be with a guy you're working with, and they're digging a hole and they're complaining about their spouse or something like that. And you think nothing of it. And then they say something, and you're like, huh, and so I think understanding, like, how do we approach people and ask them questions, and when you lead with curiosity instead of judgment, I think that's a huge one. And really just checking in on each other, and understanding that if it was a hard day, maybe call somebody after the job, and be like, hey dude, I know that did not go as well, like, are you good? Like, and just building the relationships. And it's going to look different for everybody, right? Like how I check in on people is going to be very different than how someone else checks in on somebody else, and so you just have to show up and be mindful that chances are everybody on the crew is going through something that you have no idea about, right? Like whether with their family or a sickness or a stress or a bill, you know what I mean? And so just assuming that people are dealing with things and just giving people, and just, I don't know, I think sometimes it's just like we can be so hard on ourselves that sometimes we kind of take it out on other people too, and so I think just, realizing, if people aren't showing up to work, or they're missing a lot of work, or if they're showing up to work and they're kind of, their head's not in the game, you know what I mean? And so just kind of figuring out like, what's going on, how, because by the time it gets to the job, if it affects your performance, chances are it's probably affecting your relationships at home as well, right? And so just understanding that, like, sometimes, if somebody does need help calling EAP, that's an option too. I've helped people set up, their EAP kind of telehealth accounts and, checking in on people before, if they are making like a therapy appointment, which I'm a huge advocate for, that they can, check in between those things, so it's really just it's like, you kind of want to find like the magic thing, and it really is just checking in on each other and being there and being present, so that you can kind of see when someone, seems to be having a hard time, and checking in,
You share the statement that connection is protection. What are
Mm-hmm.
the attributes of a connected crew, and what can a leader do to build connection within their crew?
So a connected crew to me is like, I think communication is huge, right? And so when we talk about like psychological safety, there's a gentleman named Timothy R. Clark, and he kind of explains it really well, the stages of psychological safety. And it starts with inclusion, and it goes to learner safety, contributor safety, and challenger safety. And so, when we talk about connection, it really is, do people feel included, right? Do they feel like they're part of the crew? Are they, are you not making an apprentice eat by himself? Like that happens. So it's like, you're already out of town, and then you got to go eat by yourself, and so it's like, how do you stay connected, throughout the job? I know you do tailboards in the morning, but sometimes things change, and so it's like, are you communicating that? Can someone come to you and say, hey, this doesn't seem right, or I have an issue with this, and you actually say, okay, well, what's going on, right? And so I think, having camaraderie and realizing that, when we talk about my brother's keeper, that it's not just when things are hard, it's not just a pass the bucket, like we're showing up at funerals, it's like my brother's keeper every day. That means you're showing up, you're present, you're listening to the people on the job, you're taking the minute to be like, okay, slow down, right? Because a lot of times we're just quick, and you're under a deadline and you have your pressure, but to be able to stop and listen to somebody else on the crew, I mean, it really does build that relationship equity, right? And so then I think then it becomes like everybody kind of knows what's happening, and so if you invest it, right, you in the beginning, yes, it might slow you down, yes, it might be annoying, yes, it might be hard, but then you're building that relationship, so the next time it's like they're more apt to come to you, right, before something, is a problem and you have to now clean up a mess, right, which takes much longer, and so it's kind of like that saying, right, slow is smooth and smooth is fast,
That's it.
it's like, right, yeah. And so you do it right the first time, and then you don't have to come back. And I think it really is just building those relationships and listening and being a good leader, and that does require responsibility and accountability and an ownership for yourself, right? And how do you show up on the crew, and you set that example. A lot of things are caught, not taught, right? So like when you bring in that, when people know that they can come to you, and that you're going to listen and that you're going to take the time, I think that you're just going to have a better vibe on the crew, and you're going to enjoy, like, you should be able to enjoy the work. You're spending so much more time doing this than you are anything else in your life. Like, why not enjoy it and have good relationships and be able, to have a good work day? I think that that's possible. And there are crews out there that experience that and love the people that they work for, the companies, they feel supported. And that makes a huge difference in the morale, and then the product of work as well,
Absolutely. At the very end of your presentation, you reference Ecclesiastes 4:9-10. Two are better than one, for if either falls, his companion can lift him up. How has that shaped Union Care Solutions and your mission and who you are and just your passion for this subject?
Well, I started in ministry, and I always thought I was going to get into women's ministry, which is kind of interesting because this is really kind of like the opposite of that. But I do have the pleasure of talking to a lot of wives and stuff too. But for me, when we talk about two is better than one, like, we're meant to do life together, right? Like, when we read the Bible and we think of, Christ, and when he walked the earth, and he had a whole crew, right? He had 12 disciples. Like, God, the Father, the Son, the Holy Spirit, like, it's community. Like, we're meant to do this life with each other, and it's so much better when we have people in our life that we can count on and that we can rely on and we can turn to, and we don't have to do it alone. And there's a lot of really great people in this industry that have a heart for service, that understand what it means, to be a good brother and a good sister. And I see it every day. And those are the people that I actually get to work with. They're people that I have, I have a good crew of people that I go to kind of bounce ideas off of, because I've never been on a crew. I don't wake up at 3 a.m, and so it's like these guys, to get it, from the people that are in the industry, that are doing the work, that have done the work, that maybe started out and are like, hey, I started out in this and I was an asshole and I did bully and I did harass people. You know what I mean? And then they've kind of come full circle in their 20, 30 years within the industry. They've raised their kids, they've done their things, and they've seen it, and they're like, man, that wasn't the way I should have done it. But it was the way they did it because that was how they were trained, right? And so, when I talk to apprentices, I'm always like, when we talk about the things that, are hard or that they don't like, or the bullying or the harassing, because it still happens, that it's like, okay, you're going to be a journeyman. What kind of journeyman do you want to be? Do you know what I mean? Do you want to be the kind that you were brought up in, or do you want to be the guy that makes the difference? Right. And so it's like, how do we change that? And then also, addressing the people that, sometimes it's hard because it's like, they're like, well, I wasn't treated that way when I was coming up. Like, it's all great, we're talking about this now, you know what I mean? And it's like, yeah, it's true. And it wasn't okay. But now we're here and we have a choice, and we can either do it better or we can keep doing it the same way, you know what I mean? And get the same results. And so it really does cause us to come out of our comfort zone. But when you see people that do it well and are able to articulate it, and they've been in the industry and they're well respected, and and they're the guys, and a lot of the people that I've noticed, the ones that are talking about it and that are agreement capable, like, they'll listen and they've done the work and they do the work themselves, and they'll tell you, like, the things that they used to do were not good. You know what I mean? And, a lot of this industry, I mentioned my sons are 4th generation, a lot of this industry is family. You get into this because you have an uncle or your dad, your kids are following in the footsteps. And so when you realize you're working with apprentices and these are somebody's kids, and so it's like, how would you want to treat, if your kid was on a job, how would you want another journeyman to treat your son, you know what I mean, that's an apprentice, or your daughter that is in an office, you know what I mean, working, or that's out there, working, on a crew based, type of position. Like, how would you want your own family to be treated? That's a big one for me, because I hear stories and I have my own stories of, things that I've heard that my kids and my family have gone through. And, it can be rough, and so it's like, I think just realizing that there is a family aspect to it, and, that we don't have to do this stuff alone, and so faith has always been a really big part of why I've done this. I think, I think there is kind of like you mentioned, there's a movement of, this mental health. And I really do believe that it's something where, people make a good living in this trade, and it's a wonderful organization. And like I said, there's a lot of family, and I see people that go and, they go to the river together, they vacation together. I've had Thanksgiving meals with my brothers and sisters from IBW, and so when we start to see what we have, and we realize that there's a lot of goodness in it, and just that's what, we want to chase that. We want to give people hope, and know that if we keep showing up for each other, that and we keep putting that in, that like I think, there will be fruit to that, and so that's kind of my heart behind it. So
Thanks for sharing that. Your Union Care Solution model is train, mobilize, deploy. And so if somebody is listening to this episode and they're like, man, I definitely want to learn more, I want to bring this to my organization, what are the steps that somebody could take to start to bring some of these concepts to their organization?
So I think it starts with, training. There are a lot of organizations out there now, like I'd mentioned, mental health first aid, vital cog, the critical incident stress management. So, getting people trained into some of these things so that you have kind of a point person. And, I work with the IBW because that's what I know. But I think any company just getting the trainings out there and supporting the guys, and kind of being able to start having these conversations, and asking the guy, the people that are interested in kind of sharing the message. I think from what I've seen, there's always like one or two people either on a crew or within an organization that maybe have gone through something, whether they've gone through recovery or they've had, personal, things that they've gone through, that and they want to be of service, and they want to help other people, and they feel comfortable talking about this stuff. And it's finding those guys, really just finding those people that are going to be the advocates, for that are out in the field, because it's super important. There are a lot of really great safety people, but you need people that are out there. You need the ones that are trusted, that the guys respect, and from my experience, who they are. Like if you ask the guys, like, who would you go? Just pull a crew, you know what I mean? And say, who would you go to for this stuff? And so having those, conversations, I think that's a really great start. And incorporating, there's toolbox talks, that you can find on mental health, and so like you had mentioned, there are so many other organizations that kind of are geared around this. There's a lot of people that, talk about this topic and share their stories, and, kind of promote other organizations as well. And so just kind of educating yourself too, right? And when, what does that look like, and how you show up? And then, peer support's really important. It's something that I'm helping Local 47 launch in January. And so kind of creating like a Zoom call where guys can call in and, have one that's maybe recovery based. And so if that's something that people are struggling with, or they're out of town, they have a spot they can call in. And so I think peer support is really huge. And that can look different across the board, peer support too could just be like going to dinner, or talking about those things, but bringing up those conversations. And then for the critical incident stress management, again, getting people trained in those things, and being able to have people be deployed during those times. And so I think for what I've seen, it really is just starting to have these conversations, and kind of building it within a structure that makes sense,
Jenny, how can people find you? What are some of your handles on social media, and what is your contact information for Union Care
Yeah.
Solutions?
So I have unicaresolutions.org online, and you can connect with me there. And also I'm on Instagram at Unicare Solutions on there. So you can find me there. You can send me an email. Lavin at unioncaresolutions.org, and I could connect you and, you know, help send your way. And it's interesting because a lot of the stuff that I've done has kind of happened organically, which I like because I feel it becomes sustainable. So, you know, I would just say if you have a heart for service, you know, to reach out, and I could get you connected.
Thank you, Jenny. And are there any final thoughts that you'd like to leave our audience with today?
Yeah, I think for the most part, you know, this is can be such a hard conversation, and you know, when we talk about this stuff and safety, and there can be so many people that, you know, what is the root cause, or who are we going to blame, and it can be kind of I mean, obviously, it can be such a downer, right? Like, it's really hard stuff that we're talking about. But I would just like to leave people with, you know, the thought that if this is on their heart and they have their own experiences, or this is something that they feel called to lead or to be a part of, to just reach out and to do something, right? That they can start small, and that there's a lot of really great people doing a lot of really great things that are out there. And, you know, to be the brother or sister that you wish you had, you know, and show up on the crew the way that that you wish you could be, that you had there on there.
Jenny,
Sorry,
thank you for
that
sharing
one.
your time, your expertise, and your heart for the people who keep our world running. And to everyone listening, thanks for being a part of the WorkReady community. If you haven't subscribed or left a review, I'd be grateful if you did. It's one of the best ways to help us continue bringing powerful, purpose-driven conversations to the trades. And until next time, remember, you matter, you're worth investing in, and our communities are grateful for your service. Thank you so much.